Today I'd like to read some excerpts from the website of Peter Hidas. Now I've added some annotations concerning the Pope. I believe the 23rd, Pope John the 23rd, and also a Swede named Wallenberg. Just because those aren't popular figures that are well known, I've added some elaborative detail. But otherwise, you can find this material at www.sympatico.ca/thidas. That is the website of Peter Hidas. Peter Hidas is a doctor of history at Dawson College in Quebec. In 1997, he published a book called Canada and the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, which you can go buy on Amazon. So the text that I'm going to be reading today is a composite of two texts. If you look at the two texts, really they're very similar. They include a lot of the same detail, but one is an overview from the medieval period to the present day, and one focuses really specifically on Hungary from, say, the 17th century to the 20th century. So I've glued those two together. Again, most of this is reading straight from Peter Hidas, and you can go look at his sources on his website, but I have added annotations for the Pope and for a Swedish man named Wallenberg, who I knew nothing about. So the two texts are a brief outline of the history of the Jews of Hungary, and as well as Canada and the Hungarian Jewish refugees 1956 to 1957. So the brief outline was a speech delivered on the 13th of December 1992 at the Temple Emanu-El Beth Solom in Westmount, Quebec in Canada. Let us begin. Ladies and gentlemen, I must confess to you that while I am a historian, I am an accidental historian of the Jews of Hungary. Let me explain to you the first adjective, accidental, before I undertake the difficult task of outlining 1,000 years of Jewish martyrdom and glory in Hungary. Almost a decade ago, while searching for the material in the archives of Hungary about the post-1848 regime, I discovered an interesting demographic phenomenon which I later identified as hidden urbanization. With my finding, I immediately went to see a friend of mine in the Historical Institute of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, a well-known historian and a Jew. He advised me not to proceed with my research because the publication of my thesis, the exclusive role of the Jews in the urbanization of Hungary between 1830 and 1870, would disturb the delicate state of Hungarian-Jewish relations. Dismayed, I consulted the head of the rabbinical seminary in Budapest, but his response was identical to my friend's. Ignoring the views of these Jewish historians, in 1988, I proceeded with my work and presented my final study at a conference of the University of Jerusalem. My two consultants were present, but now they were not Jewish Hungarians, but Hungarian Jews. And here lies the dilemma of a community which survived 1,000 years in Hungary and has been suffering an identity crisis ever since. In the Romanian province of Pannonia, situated in the western part of present-day Hungary, there already lived, in the last 100 years of the empire, a few Jews, mainly Romanized soldiers and tradesmen. We know little about their fate or the presence of other Jews in the next 500 years, but according to an old coffeehouse joke, there was continuity. One day, the aristocrat Aristide and Cohen, the Jew, debated whose forefathers were first in the Danubian Valley. Aristide said, "My ancestors crossed the Carpathian Mountains in the 9th century. "My dear Aristide," responded Cohen, "don't you know that my ancestors were already waiting for your people at this side of the Vereke Straits, offering for sale maces and other weapons for the conquest?" Who was right? The answer is rabbinical. They were both there first. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine tells us that some of the tribes of the Khazar nation rebelled against their rulers. The insurgents consisted of 3 tribes who were called Kavars or Kabars. The government prevailed. Some of the rebels were slaughtered, but some fled the country and settled with the Hungarians who lived at this time in the Ukraine. Amongst the dissident Kabar tribes, who de facto took over the leadership of the Magyar tribes, there were Jews. They together invaded and settled present-day Hungary in the 9th century. John Cinemus, the Byzantine chronicler, mentions troops observing the Jewish law fighting with the Hungarian army in Dalmatia in 1154. By that time, there was a Jewish community in existence for 150 years with its own synagogue and legal court in Esztergom, in the capital and commercial center of Hungary. Jews at the time worked the land, practiced trades and commerce along with other Hungarians. The medieval popes pressured the kings to introduce anti-Jewish laws, but for a while without result. The 11th century Crusaders murdered Jews on their way to the Holy Land, but while King Solom refused passage to these religious fanatics, he let the Jewish refugees from Austria, Bohemia, and Moravia settle in Hungary. For the next 200 years, while the West Jews were locked into ghettos, branded, isolated, and at times burnt at the stake, all was quiet in Hungary. In the early 13th century, Rome again pressured the king of Hungary to brand the Jews and burn the Talmud in public under threat of excommunication. The promise was made, but there is no evidence to its execution. By now, many of the Hungarian Jews were in the business of finance and were essential for the good management of the state. In 1251, they were declared servants of the treasury. They participated in the founding of Buda and settled in all parts of the country unhampered. The good times soon came to an end in the 14th century. Religious intolerance combined with commercial jealousy led to overtaxation, persecution, blood libels, and expulsions. Take a loan from the Jews, then burn the letter of credit was the new slogan of kings, German city dwellers, and Hungarian lords. 1421, the magistrate of Buda ordered the Jews to wear red caps, pointy hats, and a yellow spot on their outfits. A change on the throne was now a special occasion for robbing the Jews in the towns. The Turkish occupation of Hungary was nothing but a blessing in disguise for the now completely impoverished Jewish community. The Ottoman rulers taxed heavily but evenly. They tolerated all religions. So did the Protestant Hungarians who ruled the Turkish satellite Transylvania. Gabor Bethlen invited Sephardim Jews in 1623 to settle in his lands. Meanwhile, Buda was flourishing. Then, the Habsburgs liberated Hungary. They freed Buda and butchered all the Jews they could find therein. 18th century Hungary, that semi-independent eastern mark of the Habsburg family, began a slow socio-economic reconstruction after a devastating reconquest and an equally painful civil war. Once the Turks were expelled and the anti-Habsburg Magyar rebels suppressed, the government of Vienna could proceed with the domestic aspects of empire building. According to Bishop Kolonich, following their withdrawal from Hungary, the Turks had left nobody behind but the Greeks and the Jews. This, of course, was an exaggeration, but these were the people Kolonich noted and highly disapproved. In fact, Hungary was reduced to less than 2.6 million souls by 1720. In the absence of a domestic bourgeoisie in Hungary, the Viennese treasury, in order to attract settlers, gave special trading privileges to foreign merchants. The Magyars no longer had the skill or the desire to trade. It is well known, wrote Gyula Sekfu, that a Hungarian did not stoop to trade in feudal Hungary. He yielded it to the aliens, Jews, Macedonians, Greeks, Armenians, Serbs. Jewish emancipation to Hungary started at the end of the 17th century when refugees from Austria and Germany settled in western Hungary. During the first decade of the 18th century, there were still only about 4,000 Jews in the country. When Charles III forbade young Jews to marry in Moravia, a new wave of Jewish immigrants left for Hungary, where they were welcomed by the large landowners who needed merchants and tradesmen on their estates. German townsmen resented these non-Christian competitors, but for a while they were busy fighting off their main competitors, the Greeks. By the end of the century, the Greeks lost their trade privileges. They bought land blending into the gentry class or left for the Balkans. Jewish traders were ready to take over their economic role in Hungary. Meanwhile, more refugees arrived from Maria Theresa's newly conquered land, Galicia, increasing the Jewish population to 100,000 by 1800. The French Enlightenment had its impact on the Habsburg Empire. The Habsburgs fancied themselves as enlightened monarchs. The Hungarian nobles became modernizing liberal nationalists, and the Jews wished to become Hungarian Jews. In 1783, Joseph II partially emancipated the Jews. He let them pursue trades and commerce, allowed them to settle in towns, but asked them to acquire German names, to speak German, and to go to schools. The Hungarian nobility had few objections. The German urban dwellers were guild-oriented feudal traders and merchants who opposed Magyarization. The Jews were modern businessmen, able to market Hungarian agricultural products at home and abroad, able to raise capital for the building of railway lines and for the regulations of rivers. The German merchants and craftsmen who hated their Jewish competitors rioted and organized pogroms in the midst of the Hungarian War of Independence in 1848 to 1849. Hidden urbanization meant a fundamental change in the social composition of the towns. Certain groups abandoned the towns and were replaced everywhere by prominent Jewish communities. These communities became the yeast for capitalist development because the majority of their breadwinners were free merchants, the rest having mainly other urban-type occupations. The change was a rapid one, taking place in the 1850s and intensifying in the 1860s. There was no other group that participated in this development besides the Jews. The Jewish communities took a fundamental, if not exclusive, role in the general urbanization of Hungary and, at the same time, provided the economy with the most important source of domestic capital accumulation, commerce. By 1867, when Hungarians began to direct their own political affairs again, they had in their midst a new middle class with whom they had a chance to build a modern economy. The period from 1867 to the outbreak of the First World War was the golden age of Hungarian Jewry. Hard work, experience in business, international commercial connections, the proper use of new educational opportunities, assimilation, business alliances between the Jewish elite and the aristocracy, and the constant support of the liberal nationalist gentry political elite brought great dividends. Complete emancipation in 1868 opened most venues for Jews. By 1896, of the 95 bank directors, 38 were Jewish. At the stock exchange, Jews held 33 of the 39 seats. The Association of Industrialists had 49 members. 44 of them were Jewish. By 1910 in Budapest, Jews constituted 53% of persons engaged in industry, 65% of those in trade and finance, 59% of the medical personnel, and 62% of the lawyers. The Magyar nobility accepted the Jewish community massively in terms of intermarriage, a significant number. 346 of the Jewish elite was ennobled. The cultural elite and the scientific community were also heavily laden with Jews. By the turn of the century, the Hungarian economy was one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. Budapest became a metropolis where every fourth person was Jewish, or 25%. Not all benefited from the economic boom. Some were left behind. The lower gentry and the country intelligentsia resented capitalism, the loss of their privileges, and the advancement of Jews. Many Catholic priests opposed the emancipation of the Jews. Slovak peasants blamed the Hungarian-speaking Jews for their miseries. By 1875, political anti-Semitism could unfold its flag in the National Assembly. At first, it was laughed off by the liberal nationalists, but soon Jewish students were beaten up at a university, and in 1882 a blood libel was fabricated at the village of Tiszalar. There were attacks on Jews all over the country. In Budapest, the army had to be called out to prevent a pogrom. At the next election, 16 candidates with anti-Semitic programs were sent to the National Assembly. But the liberal nationalists were still in power. The bishop of Kalocsa and the hero of 1848, Louis Kossuth, warned the nation against intolerance. But this is not what the aristocrats, the gentry, and the middle class had in mind when they made the deal with the Jewish elite in 1867. Not even the overrepresentation of Jewish youth in the army and the appointment of a Jewish minister of war during the First World War moderated their growing antipathy. Some Jewish intellectuals were also disappointed and began opposing the anti-democratic, socially oppressive regime. These Jews joined the left and participated in the revolutions of 1918 and 1919. At the end of the war, the Habsburg Empire collapsed, and the liberal nationalist leadership was replaced by the right-wing nationalist wing of the nobility. Red Terror was followed by White Terror. There was a need for scapegoats, and the fact that the Red Terror was instigated by Bela Kun, a communist of Jewish origin, served as a good excuse for the murder of hundreds of Jews in 1919 and 1920. Years later, the new leader of the country, Nikolaus Horthy, told Hitler that he was an anti-Semite well before the leader of the German National Socialist movement appeared on the political scene. In 1920, Horthy introduced the quota system at the universities, restricting Jewish presence to a maximum of 6% of all students enrolled. The pogroms, however, were stopped. The regime needed respectability to obtain Western loans, and after all, the economy was still dominated by Jewish and converted Jewish businessmen. But the refugee civil servants from the lost territories, along with the Gentile middle class, were by now determined to carry out a change of the guard in business, while the populist writers were resolute to do the same in the field of culture. Anti-Semitic agitation went unabated in the press for the next 25 years. In 1933, the Prime Minister of Hungary was among the first to greet Hitler on his appointment as Chancellor. They were both anti-Semites, revisionists, and interested in economic recovery. For a partnership, however, Hitler demanded the subordination of the Hungarian economy to Germany's, the free operation of the political extreme right in Hungary, and the introduction of anti-Jewish measures. The first two demands were gradually agreed to, albeit reluctantly. The last demand was fulfilled as a kind of payment for territories returned. The first anti-Jewish law was passed in 1938 with the approval of Parliament and the blessing of the churches. The first payment was made for southern Slovakia. Next year, the second anti-Jewish law was introduced, this time Nuremberg style, based on racial criteria. This law was for Ruthenia and Transylvania, a few more jobs taken from Jews, and possibly to regain the support of the growing number of voters, especially the petty bourgeoisie and the industrial workers who recently cast their votes for fascist parties. In 1941, the third anti-Jewish law was to be the last payment to Hitler and their domestic friends. By the middle of 1942, the fortunes of war were not favoring the Axis powers. This was instantly recognized by Horthy's new Prime Minister, Nicolas Calle. He was determined to save Hungary from both the Germans and the Russians. Calle and Horthy refused all demands of the Nazis for the branding, confinement, and deportation of the Jews in Hungary. They promised to expel them from Hungary, but only after Hitler won the war. Hungarian Jews were protected abroad, and negotiations started with the Allies. The butchers of Újvidék, the officers who ordered the murder of Jews and Serbs, were arrested Foreign Jewish refugees were tolerated and sheltered. With the start of the Slovakian deportations, more and more Jews sought refuge in the relative safety of Hungary. Soon, the total number of foreign Jews in Hungary reached 50,000. But well before the 15th of March 1944, when Hitler ordered the occupation of Hungary, many Jews perished. According to the census of 1941, the population of Hungary numbered 9.3 million. There were 825,000 Jews in the country. Following the Nazi occupation of Poland, about 100,000 Poles sought and received refuge in Hungary. A significant number of them were Jewish. In 1941, the government decided to reevaluate its refugee policies. About 18,000 Jews who could not prove their Hungarian citizenship were deported to Galicia, where 16,000 of them were butchered by the SS and their Ukrainian collaborators. A year later, the infamous Újvidék raid took place. In search of Yugoslav partisans, the Hungarian army murdered 40,000 civilians, amongst them 40,000 civilians. I'm blowing up the numbers here. It's 4,000 civilians, and among them were 1,000 Jews in a southern Hungarian town. Before the German occupation, that is before the 19th of March 1944, 50 to 60,000 Jewish men were enrolled in labor battalions. By the said date, 15,000 of them were dead, and another 10,000 died before the end of the war. Of the 25,000 who were captured by the Russians, hardly any survived the war. So now we've got the road to Auschwitz opened with the German occupation. Adolf Eichmann appears, and the Hungarian genocide begins in spring 1944. About 400,000 people were deported. Horthy looks on passively. The Auschwitz Protocol, the planned extermination of the Jews of Hungary, was passed on to the Allies, to the Hungarian government, to the Jewish Council, to Horthy, and to the head of the Catholic Church. Nobody warned the victims. Nobody protested publicly. The British government forbade Palestinian Jewish commandos to parachute into Hungary and arouse the Jews. The Americans refused to bomb the railway lines leading to Auschwitz. The Canadian government declined to take in Hungarian Jewish children. The Allies disallowed trading trucks for lives, earnestly offered by the SS. The Pope addressed a personal plea to Horthy on June 25, 1944, which was followed by the warnings of President Roosevelt on June 26, and that of King Gustav of Sweden on June 30th. Horthy prohibited further deportations. By now, all the Jews from the countryside were gone. Gas chambers were working day and night. The overload was thrown onto open burning pits. In Hungary, the respite was only temporary. Eichmann, with the help of Hungarian Nazis, the Arrow Cross Party, who were put into power in October 44, continued the work. Another 50,000 were handed over to the Germans from Budapest. The number would have been 15,000 higher without the heroic activities of Raoul Wallenberg. So who is Raoul Wallenberg? Raoul Wallenberg, in May 1996, the Central Intelligence Agency released thousands of previously classified documents regarding Raoul Wallenberg. And the spelling here is confusing because sometimes it's Raoul, sometimes it's Raul. In response to requests filed under the Freedom of Information Act, these documents, along with an investigation conducted by the news magazine U.S. News and World Report, appeared to confirm the long-held suspicion that Wallenberg was an American intelligence asset during his time in Hungary. During the next 6 months, another 15,000 Jews died in Hungary, mainly as a result of Arrow Cross atrocities. Most Jews of Budapest, however, survived, albeit decimated. So most survived, albeit decimated. So I guess the definition of a decimation is 10% loss. What happened to the 490,000 deportees? 50,000 who survived the Holocaust in Germany decided to never return to Hungary. Between 350,000 and 450,000 fell victim to genocide. In mid-1945, 141,480 Hungarian citizens declared themselves Jewish by religion, 1.6% of all Hungarians. About twice that of Germany prior to Hitler in terms of percentage. Among these survivors, women outnumbered men by 37%. In Budapest, by 65%. There were few children left. 80% of them perished. The surviving elite left for the US, Canada, Australia, and France. The political parties wanted to become more popular at this time, welcomed small Nazis into their ranks, and did not accept responsibility for the Hungarian Holocaust. The Gentiles began talking about the Jewish question again. There are too many Jews here and there, in one committee or another, in one profession or another. Peter Hidas, in charge of the land reform, was soon accused of introducing an unwritten anti-Jewish law: no land for Jews. In the fight against inflation, some of the papers printed caricatures of black marketeers that could have easily been confused with drawings of Jews in the Stürmer during the Nazi era. Following a speech by Cardinal Mindszenty in a Budapest church, a crowd of a few hundred went on the streets to cheer Hungary's chief anti-Semites. The head of the Calvinist church invited the Jews of Hungary to clean up their act. As a result of these developments and decades of unrestrained anti-Semitic agitation, small wonder that soon Jewish blood was flowing again. In 1946, there were several pogroms. 21st of May, 1946, Kunmadaras, peasants murder 2 Jews, 18 are wounded. The 1st of August, 1946, Miskolc, industrial workers stage a pogrom. 2 Jews are lynched. There are other anti-Semitic disturbances in many villages. The Jewish community now became openly critical of the government. For some Jews, hope for a new world in Hungary was finally gone. They no longer wanted to be Jewish Hungarian, just Hungarian Jews. The next 2 years, at least 4,000 of them left for Israel. 1947 turned out to be a quiet year. The communists were organizing their takeover, both political and economic. Jewish businessmen lost their capital again through nationalization. Fascists were demonstrating and killing again in the village of Pochpetri, 1948. And at the instigation of the Soviet Union, an anti-Zionist campaign was initiated all over Eastern Europe. More Jews now turned their back on Hungary. 10,000 arrived in Israel between 1948 and 1949. For the next 40 years during the communist rule and Soviet occupation, the Jews were safe more or less. Popular anti-Semitism was no longer tolerated. The anti-Semitic popular writers were branded nationalist reactionaries. Only the Bolshevik state was allowed to practice anti-Semitism. During the first Hungarian show trial, the Reich trial, the leaders of the Communist Party made sure that 3 out of the 8 accused were Jewish. The top 4 Jewish leaders of the state and party wanted to show their impartiality to the people of Hungary. When Stalin initiated a vicious anti-Semitic campaign a few months before his death, his self-declared best pupil in Hungary, Matthias Rákosi, began preparing an anti-Semitic show trial. The case fizzled out with Stalin's death, but communist Jews were gradually removed from responsible positions, and the Jewish head of the secret police was imprisoned. The expulsion of the Jews from public life was completed during the Kadar regime. The Jews disappeared from public life. The government only left them to concentrate in the cultural life in large number. The leaders of the community kept up their total conformity, concentrated on helping the poor, and the rabbis on attending the declining number of bar mitzvahs and increasing number of funerals. In the mid-1970s, Jewish life began to experience a miracle. The leaders of the rabbinical seminary challenged the traditional leadership of the community. Its head, Alexander Scheiber, advocated that the Jews of Hungary must be both Jewish Hungarians and Hungarian Jews at the same time. Assimilated young Jews developed an interest in their past, in their ancestors, that is, themselves. Some went to see Scheiber, others met socially with their fellow alienated Jews to discuss life, Jewish life. While the communist state degraded, popular anti-Semitism rose up once again at football matches, in the high schools, and in the press. The statue of Wallenberg, the CIA asset, was besmirched. The populist wing of the ruling party today is led by the and of course he's writing back in this is written in 1992. So he was saying that the leader was an anti-Semitic poet, Istvan Churka. A few weeks ago, he led 15,000 of his followers in mass demonstrations on the street of Budapest. On October 23rd, 1992, on the anniversary of the Revolution of 1956, neo-Nazi thugs wearing SS caps, flying arrow cross flags, jeered the President of the Republic. But there is another side to Hungary. 40 years of communist rule had some positive sides to it. The nation was educated and Europeanized. The peasants of Hungary became farmers, and since the 1960s, the middle classes learnt the value of private enterprise. Pope John XXIII challenged the attitude of the Catholic Church toward the Jews, and this development had its impact on the Hungarian Church. In 1959, Pope John XXIII removed the Latin word perfidis from the prayer for the conversion of the Jews in the Good Friday liturgy. He also made a confession for the Church of the sin of anti-Semitism through the centuries. While the Second Vatican Council was being held, John XXIII tasked Cardinal Augustin Bea with the creation of several important documents that pertain to reconciliation with Jewish people. On the 17th of March, 1962, he stopped his car, this is Pope John XXIII, stopped his car when he saw people exiting the synagogue in Rome and blessed them in the morning. A rabbi described the scene. After a moment of understandable bewilderment, the Jews surrounded him and applauded him enthusiastically. It was, in fact, the first time in history that a pope had blessed Jews, and was perhaps the first real gesture of reconciliation. Jewish institutions are flourishing again in Hungary. Gentile Hungarians are anxious to prove that their country is a civilized place. The president and the prime minister of Hungary formed an honor guard at the befouled statue of the CIA asset Wallenberg. The parliament offered an apology to the Jewish community in the name of the nation for the crimes of the past, and offered some financial compensation to the survivors of the Holocaust. To counter the Churka demonstration, over 100,000 Hungarians demonstrated silently in Budapest against neo-Nazism and intolerance in general. One can only hope that the 80,000 Jews who live in Hungary today may finally find their peace locally, provided that the anti-Semitic tradition of the past 100 years will be lingering on only in the controllable fringes of society. So, I've had Hector Quinn criticize. He says we shouldn't talk about Jewish people. That's it's like, you shouldn't talk about politics, you shouldn't talk about religion. That's just it's too private of a thing, it's too intimate of a thing, we shouldn't talk about it. And of course, Morgan Freeman made the argument that we shouldn't have a Black History Month because talking about race only perpetuates racism. But Morgan Freeman can say that, but he's black. And as a white person, I feel that being colorblind, ignoring these issues, only perpetuates them more. Silence is violence, and so to not talk about anti-Semitism is to encourage anti-Semitism. In fact, we have to talk incessantly about Jewish people. If we don't, if we don't incessantly have a daily reminder and never forget about Jewish history, then we will only inevitably just slip back into the metaphysical ignorance of anti-Semitism. So I hope you appreciated this little historical lesson. If you guys can track down, I did quick Google searches on this guy, Peter Hidas. Maybe we could send some letters to Peter Hidas and see his updated opinion. I don't know, he might have died by now. He could have been, that was nearly 20 years ago that he was writing in 1997. So I don't know, he might not be alive anymore. He might be very old. He might have Alzheimer's. But it's interesting stuff. So thank you to Peter Hidas. He's done a service to the Jewish community, even though he said his friend from the Historical Institute advised him not to proceed with this research because it would disturb the delicate state of Hungarian-Jewish relations. And then he consulted the rabbinical seminary, and they also told him don't talk about this stuff. But he ignored the views of these Jewish Hungarians, and he proceeded with the works. And so it's a beautiful thing he's done there. It's a work of scholarship. It's a work of philo-Semitism that celebrates the martyrdom and the glory of Jews in Hungary over the last 1,000 years. So, I would like to do more of this stuff. I got a bunch of archives here. I have a lot of academic archives that are just buried and hidden away, and I'm starting to pull them out and take a look at them, and maybe we can do some more readings like this for edification and education, because we know that ignorance is hatred, and the more educated you become and the more things you know, the more objective and tolerant you become. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.